The truth is that funding is becoming increasingly competitive. I think there's a 55% year-on-year increase in the number of applications that a grant maker is getting. There are some mistakes that are stopping you from standing out. And the first of which, to be a bit blunt, is a lot of applications are quite boring. They're really academic, they're really in the detail, and it's because we as charities or COCs are set up to fund a very specific solution, and we go straight into the detail of how that solution works, whereas the funder isn't necessarily even aware of the problem. You have probably spent hours on something that they are probably going to spend minutes on, which sucks. Like, we hate to think about the fact that we've crafted an email that someone is going to read in the 2 minutes they have between meetings. But that is the case. How you shape your story in a way that makes people want to help you change the ending.
Welcome to the Social Impact Journal. My name is Jack Farren and I'm your host. And this is the podcast where I talk to change makers around the world driving social impact. This week, I'm joined by Andy King. Andy is the founder of Fireside Fundraising, and we're going to be getting into the mind of a donor. If you enjoy this episode, please do share with your colleagues and friends, and make sure to leave a rating or review on the show. Andy, thanks so much for joining me on the show. Really looking forward to this topic.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks, Jack.
Cool. So, inside the mind of a donor. What does that mean?
Inside the mind of a donor is about approaching donors from their perspective. Very commonly, when we're thinking about our charity or our organization, we approach it from our perspective. We give explanations of who we are and what we do that assume a lot of knowledge and interest, whereas what we talk about very commonly is about approaching it from that donor first mindset, giving them the level of information and emotion that they need to get on board with you.
So I know you work with a lot of charities and CICs. How do you help those organizations?
Yeah, sure. There's kind of three key ways that I work with those organizations, which is generally about how you shape your story in a way that makes people want to help you change the ending. Fundamentally, that's what charities do or CICs do, is they spot a problem and they try and solve it. And it's about building that movement of people who'll come with you. So the ways that we tend to do that is kind of how you tell your story, so kind of what your pitch is or how you explain your services, who you're pitching to, so who your prospect is, what the companies are, who the foundations are, or what you're pitching in the first place, so what change you can promise you'll make, what that donor will receive back. So it's kind of a how, a who, and a what of how you tell your story.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say I'm running an NGO, even in personal experience with rural inclusion. There's been times where we targeted, foundations or corporates, and you're writing grant application after application after application, and you're not successful. Wondering, what is it that's against us? What would you ask to a client that was coming to you that had shared that problem?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something that a lot of people come up against. The truth is that funding is becoming increasingly competitive. I think there's a 55% year-on-year increase in the number of applications that a grant maker is getting. So let's say you got 100 applications last year, you're getting 155 this year. It is a really competitive space, and there are some mistakes that are stopping you from standing out. And the first of which, to be a bit blunt, is a lot of applications are quite boring. They're really academic, they're really in the detail, and it's because we as charities or COCs are set up to fund a very specific solution, and we go straight into the detail of how that solution works, whereas the funder isn't necessarily even aware of the problem. And because you haven't delved into the detail and particularly the emotional consequences of that problem, they're not invested in helping you solve it. you're busy talking about how your bandages are cheaper than normal bandages, and the funder doesn't even know that bandages are expensive, let alone the fact that because bandages are expensive, people's wounds aren't being healed. So I would say that being boring is kind of sin number one, and you fix that by starting from the problem rather than the solution. There's an Ogilvy quote that says, if you want to sell a fire extinguisher, start with a fire. And it's that kind of approach of talk about the problem that you're solving. So being boring is number one, but number two is being too technical. Again, we're in these solutions all the time, but that means that we forget that not everyone knows what we mean when we say biodiversity, or not everyone knows what we mean when we say climate resilience. Yeah. We're busy saying biodiversity and climate resilience every day, so we forget that's not normal language. Whereas if we take the time to really break that down, to think about what does biodiversity mean, it means protecting the air that we breathe and the food that we eat. Not only is that much easier for a funder to understand, it also happens to be much more emotionally engaging. So by being simple and by being interesting, you're going to give yourself that chance to really, really stand out. I think the last thing to think about is, because it is so increasingly competitive, these funders are reading really quickly. Yeah. You have probably spent hours on something that they are probably going to spend minutes on, which sucks. Like, we hate to think about the fact that we've crafted an email that someone is going to read in the 2 minutes they have between meetings. But that is the case. And so by making it short, by making it punchy, and by making it compelling, you are much more likely to stand out. And those are probably the starting points I would go to, is like, from an outside perspective, is it clear why this matters rather than what you're looking at? Can I follow what you're asking for? And have you made me care? And if you get a yes to those three questions, you're probably starting from a pretty good place.
Okay. So if you mentioned at the start about, let's say, being boring. And I think, any innovator or any leader of a non-profit, is so passionate about the cause that they're trying to address. But of course, the funder might be funding a variety of different interventions. So inside the mind of a donor at that stage, when they're receiving so many applications, what is that period like for them? Let's say they've had a request for applications and applications coming in. What does that period look like for them?
What it looks like for the funder, you mean? Yeah, good question. It is an overwhelming time, I would say. And so it is really worth noting that, again, their experience of reading it is really different to your experience of writing it. And what is going to stand out is the simple emotional language. The bit of a charity that is interesting to the founder is very often the unique selling point. For your example, what makes rural inclusion different from other charities in a similar space? That's probably the bit that interests you as a founder the most. And we therefore assume that that's what interests the funder the most. But that's a really logical and detailed place to go, that to capture takes a lot of page space, but also brain space. And that's not page space or brain space that funder has, because they're reading those hundreds of applications. What's interesting to the funder is the stuff that's emotionally engaging. I think very commonly we think that the thing that is going to make a funder choose us is the logical arguments. But actually our emotional brains are so much faster that if you're trying to put across a unique selling point in an application, that unique selling point should be the strength of the feeling that you give the person reading it, because they are operating at overwhelm. They're reading 100 applications in just an hour, and they're having to choose what to not include. Anything that they don't understand because it's got jargon in it, anything that they skip over, anything that assumes a level of knowledge that they don't have or doesn't detail why the problem is a problem is going to be easy to rule out, simply because there will be so many applications that do make them feel something.
Yeah. But you mentioned about the problem and focusing on the problem to create emotion from the funder. What about if the problem is something that the funder maybe doesn't have a huge understanding of or personal experience of? How would you approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it often boils down to, how do I convince this funder that they should care about other people? Because hopefully they just care about other people. But a huge thing that we can play with is relatability. For example, if you are applying to an American foundation and you are operating in rural Zambia, trying to get someone who has lived their entire life in America to imagine what it's actually like to be a subsistence farmer in rural Zambia is not going to be possible. And therefore, what you should focus on is the things that they can relate to, such as the feelings of that farmer, whether it's uncertainty about rain and relating to people on a weather basis, whether it's concern for your family, rather than trying to get them to picture what it's like to be the farmer, trying to get them to picture what it's like to experience that problem or struggle with that issue. There are kind of two human base fears. Everyone is scared of a number of things. Like, some people are scared of clowns or heights. If you put me on a tall building with a clown, I will hate you. But actually, every human is scared of two things, which is loneliness or death. And if you can work out as a charity or as a CIC, whether you're a loneliness charity or a death charity or both, and put that into that framing, that can really help you. So, for example, with that kind of Zambian farmer, is it that they're worried that they're not going to be able to feed themselves and they will starve? Or is it that they feel really stressed and on their own? Or is it both? And grounding it in that loneliness or that fear of life is something that everyone can relate to, whether they know the circumstances or not.
Is that quite harsh, though, in terms of trying to tell the story?
All of this stuff has to be taken in the way that works for you. And there's a phrase called boiling the ocean, which is something that you obviously want to try and avoid doing. You don't want to kind of overclaim or over exaggerate. But what you want to think about is, if the solution is the entrepreneurship training, what is the problem? The problem is likely to be a lack of traditional employment opportunity. Why is that problem a problem? What does that problem feel like to live that problem? And then you can start to think about, okay, well, the people for whom this program exists feel frustrated or feel held back in some way, or feel like there isn't a market for themselves and they want to create that. And you don't have to use the word loneliness, but frustration, for example, is a good place to go. Obviously, the other thing to consider when you're doing that is the ethics of how you put that across, because where a wine company is selling you a glass of wine and a chocolate bar company is selling you a chocolate bar, effectively what we're selling as fundraisers and charities is stories of people's lives. And it's really worth us remembering that there's real stories of real people's lives. And therefore, we want to make sure that we're telling those stories in a way that, if it was our story, we'd be comfortable with. So I've spoken a couple of times about the importance of emotion, and it's really worth, as you're telling your story, to think about specifically which emotion it is that you're trying to tap into. And it's worth noting that when I say emotion, you might hear make them cry, and that is not what I'm saying. Anger is a great emotion. Pride is a great emotion. Sadness is a decent emotion. The worst emotion you can tap into is pity. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it's kind of gross. I've done it as a fundraiser. I spent my early career telling stories that were centered on pity, and I just didn't like doing it. It didn't feel very nice. But secondly, and possibly more importantly, it doesn't actually work that well. Pity-based relationships, pity and guilt, are really good at getting money from someone once, but they'll never engage with you again.
Yep.
Whereas anger or pride or excitement are really good at getting money from people in a way that will keep them coming back to you and join your movement. It's why comic relief has really moved away from like sending the white celebrity out to Africa to like cry in front of the camera to elicit pity, because they've realized that it actually fundamentally turns people off in the long term. So yeah, I completely agree with you that you don't want to go to kind of a harsh extreme. You want to think about, how can we do this ethically? How do we remember that this is someone's story? What is the emotion that we want to put at the heart of it?
Cool. So let's stay with the Zambia example. So there's been a request for applications from a trust. Let's say in the UK, we've applied. They've read. We've actually got through the first stage.
Nice. Congrats.
Thanks. What are you thinking? You're the funder.
Yeah, good question. At that point, if it's a multiple stage application, they have probably put through multiple people, right? It was probably, let's say there was 100 in round one, there's probably 10 in round two. So it's still a competitive scenario.
It's quite a fall off from stage one.
Yeah, massively. Yeah. Most funders, even with multiple stages, the cuts will be pretty drastic. And at that point, they'll start to be paying a bit more attention. And what you want to be doing at that point is building the business case. Okay. So in stage one, you want to make them feel something. In stage two, you want to make them see the logic at that point. Okay. So you want to be looking at cost effectiveness. You want to be looking at why your model. But in particular, you want to be looking at why them. And by why them, I mean why them, the funder. What do the two of you, your organisation and their organisation, have in common? Why is it that they should give you money rather than someone else? It's the bit that we often miss out because we're so busy talking about why us that we don't say why them. But actually talking about their history of investing in Zambia, or the fact that their charity guidelines do talk about youth employment, or the fact that they have a history of sustaining programs for the long term, the more you can send a second stage application that says, we've come to you because we think you are the right partner for this. Yep. Here is the logic of why. It's going to stand you out to hopefully be chosen, whether that's at a pitch stage or off the cuff.
Is that the same type of approach whether you're dealing with a corporate foundation or a trust, or is it slightly different in terms of why them?
Yeah, good question. With a corporate foundation, I would talk about the company of which they are the foundation of as much as you possibly can. With a foundation, I would talk about the foundation. Yeah. So it is similar advice, but let's say Norton Rose Fulbright Foundation are a legal foundation. They are a separate entity from Norton Rose. If I were in the second stage with them, I would be talking about the company rather than the foundation and why it would be good for Norton Rose, because fundamentally that is where the money comes from. So I would be looking at why you through the lens of why the decision makers, and wherever the money is coming from, why them.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting. So the one thing that's definitely happened to us, but a lot of contacts in the space tell us as well, you spend hours crafting a proposal, you don't get through stage one. But you also get a generic email, maybe an automated email of, sorry, competitive application, you haven't gone through to the next stage. And that's really frustrating because you've spent a lot of time there, but you also want to learn. Yeah, you want to be able to adapt to see what can we do for the next call. Now, on the topic of the episode, inside the mind of a donor, it would be good to see, why not? I can kind of understand, time constraints, but what are they feeling at that stage?
Yeah, it's hard, right? Because it's similar to job applications. You spend ages and sometimes you don't hear back. And I think there are some pretty bad fundraising there are some pretty bad funding practices out there. They should give you feedback if they can, but I do think it's worth remembering the level of overwhelm that these people are approaching their role with. Most foundations are run by volunteers, rich volunteers, sure, but volunteers nonetheless. And so many of them are overrun by applications that it's just not that possible to respond to everyone, particularly if you're in the first round. And I think while I get it's super frustrating, taking the learning that you can from having put together that application, and in particular, one of the things I really like about the fundraising space is how open we are with sharing. If a funder won't give you feedback, asking a peer in the sector to review it and give you their feedback and maybe doing a swap of applications of things that could be improved is a different way of still gathering that feedback while empathizing with the fact that that funder is doing their best, even if their best isn't that good.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we'll look at corporate fundraising specifically. In terms of approaching a corporate, there's the financial aspect of funding, but also the non-financial benefits of corporate partnerships. Is it a slightly different angle to pitch, why them and why a partnership could look?
Yeah, sure. There's a really famous saying in corporate partnerships, which is if you ask for advice, you get money. If you ask for money, you get advice. And that's really frustrating from a fundraising angle, but it does show us that when we're approaching a company, we do need to be a bit smarter. And the best thing we can do as an organization is work out what advice we genuinely need, so that in the worst case, we get that advice. And in the best case, we get that advice and the money to see it through. So it's really helpful to think about your corporate partners as vehicles for achieving your mission. Because if I ask you why you need a corporate partner and you say because we need money, that's not super inspiring. Whereas if I continue to dig with you and say, why do you need corporate partners? Because we need money. Well, why do we need money? Because people don't have opportunities in rural Zambia. If we can then skip that step and say we need corporate partners because people don't have opportunities in rural Zambia, it's a much more inspiring place that partnerships can start from.
Okay, so it's lead with advice and
lead with something they can help you with, whether that's through money or skills, is a very good place to begin.
Great. And if our audience are listening to this and they really want to follow up and see how they can get inside the mind of a donor, but perhaps don't have big budgets for consultants, is there any helpful resources out there that you could direct them to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, great question. I'll plug my own first.
For sure. Go ahead.
If you go to firesidefundraising.com/recipe, there's a kind of free DIY fundraising toolkit that helps you work out how to tell your story, who to tell it to. But beyond that, if you want to get inside the mind of a donor, 2 books that I'd really recommend are Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and Mind Over Money by Claudia Hammond. And the reason I really recommend those books is they basically look at how our brains work in general. Okay. Because when we think about the mind of a donor, we probably picture this like grey, faceless, suited man that has more in common with ChatGPT than with you or I. But actually, those foundations and those companies are run by people who are people like you and I, and their brains work the exact same way that our brains work. And so by understanding human psychology, you are understanding donor psychology really well too.
Yeah, fantastic. Is there any other resources apart from those books and the recipe, which we'll include in the show notes?
Yeah, I would honestly say fundraising, which is what we're looking at, is one of the most collaborative professions I've ever encountered. And having done a lot of corporate fundraising, I've encountered a lot of professions. And there are a huge number of fundraising networking groups There's like the Kenyan Association of Fundraising Professionals. There's IFC, which is the International Fundraising Congress. There's the Resource Alliance. There are a huge number. It's really worth looking at what the networks are available to you, because fundraisers will give you practical advice about what they've tried. They can review your applications. They can give you those honest conversations. Yeah, reaching out to real people would probably be my number one tip.
Brilliant. So I think the insights today are really going to help people get inside the mind of a donor. Now, before I ask you my final question, which is to write a page in your own social impact journal, a question about AI. Now, we talk about getting inside the mind of a donor, but I'm seeing there's a lot more tools coming out in terms of AI to help grant writing. What have you seen in that space?
Yeah, great question. My favourite use of AI for fundraising is to ask AI to create you a case for support for your charity. Not because the case of support is very good, but it shows you what the internet thinks your charity cares about. And it gives you a really good summary of the messaging you are currently putting out. And it's a really good kind of temperature check of, is this actually how we want to be seen on the internet? Yeah. But in terms of tailoring and getting to know a company, it can be really good to put in specific websites and say, hey, there's this specific company and our charity website. ChatGPT, tell me what we have in common.
Okay.
Because that why you piece of why you the funder, the more things you can point to having in common, the better. Yeah. The thing I wouldn't use AI for is prospecting, as in working out who to go to, because it makes things up, and that's not very helpful for us.
Yeah, or the problem, the emotion.
Yes, indeed. And in particular, simplifying your language. If you put into ChatGPT, this is who we are. Hey, ChatGPT, how would you explain that to an 8-year-old? That is a really useful way of making your language more simple.
What about if your English is not your first language and you're writing an application for let's say a funder where they only accept in English? Could that also be a good use case to like fine tune, to review the grammar that you're using?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, AI grammar tools aren't new. Grammarly has existed since I was a child, I think. It's definitely worth using those checkers. There's one called Hemingway, named after the writer, that is a really good checker for like, does this sound good in native English? Yeah, those kind of tools are definitely worth checking out, I'd say.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, AI, who knows where it will be in 5 years, and obviously affecting all industries, including the fundraising space.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you had your own page in your own social impact journal, this is a question I asked to all of my guests, and each guest writes their own page, but to a different audience. So your audience is, let's say, the executive director of the NGO in Zambia, who is trying to secure more funds to advance their mission. What would you write for them to read into how to get inside the mind of a donor?
That's a great question. I really like to start things with cheesy quotes, so I would probably start with a cheesy quote. There's an author called Bobette Buster who said that stories are the fire that we carry to each other, which is actually why Fireside is called Fireside. And I think I would start with that, of stories are the fire that we carry to each other, and say that I know how hard they're working and how incredible it is that they have dedicated themselves to making the change they want to see in the world. But to do that, they need to take a step back sometimes and think about the fires they can set, rather than just being the fire themselves. And my number one advice is, if you want to solve a problem, you probably know how to solve the problem, but you can't do it by yourself. And so think about what made you care in the first place and focus on that rather than on the things that you're doing day to day now. Why do you care? Why do you care? Why do you care? Will grow the fire, and that will create the change that you want to see.
Fantastic. Well, Andy, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing all your insights into how to get inside the mind of a donor. And I'm sure it's going to be really helpful for those listening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for watching this episode with Andy on the Social Impact Journal. If you did enjoy the episode, please do share with your networks, and we'll see you next Monday for our next episode. Goodbye.